Hey everyone, just Parry here today. I just want to talk a little bit about Hebraism since that's come up from Scripture Central, and now Mormonish Podcast has done something, and Mormonism Live, as of the time of this recording, will be going on tomorrow to talk about Scripture Central's or Book of Mormon Central's video that just released talking about Hebraic structures as evidence for the ancient and supernatural origin of the Book of Mormon. Uh, we're going to discuss this a little bit when we get a little bit further along in our Come Follow Me podcast series. But I wanted to lay the groundwork for what we're going to discuss then. Maybe that way this video can serve as a jumping off point so we can just get right into things when we get into the sections that actually have apologetics going back to Hebraisms. In talking with apologists and kind of hearing their side of why we should consider any given purported Hebraism weight as evidence for the ancient or supernatural origin of the Book of Mormon, I've tried to develop a fair way of assessing each one of those Hebraisms and to try and actually show the apologists like actual grounded reasons why I'm not going to actually consider that as evidence for the claim that they're trying to make. So I don't just want to sit and make the statement that this is bad evidence, and so I'm not going to listen to it, or I just want to accept that for this, that, or the other reason. And honestly, like the reasons that critics give for not listening to or not accepting any given piece of evidence for the value of that Hebraism as actual ancient evidence, they're all like basically all that I've heard of them are generally pretty sound. But I wanted to actually have like a more systemized approach to it. I don't want to be flippant or at least come across as being dismissive of any one of those claims. And I haven't necessarily succeeded in getting apologists to accept that I'm not just being dismissive, but at the very least I can show that there is some groundwork that I'm doing to assess the claim. And so what I've developed is a 3-factor test. And what this test requires is for the purported Hebraism to pass all 3 factors. And if it can do that, then that means that we can assess it as a potential evidence for the ancient origin of the Book of Mormon. It does not assess the actual quality of that evidence. It only looks at sort of a binary whether or not it even should be considered for evaluation as evidence for that, for the faithful narrative. At this point, I have not found a single purported Hebraism that has actually passed all 3 points. I find that most of them fail on multiple factors. It's not too common that they fail on all 3. Apologists are generally pretty good about capturing at least one of those 3 factors. There are some that do fail on all 3. But yeah, I'll just kind of go over and explain what these 3 factors are. So in broad general terms, they are intentionality, uniqueness or pertinence to the Hebrew language, and unavailability in Joseph Smith's milieu. And so the first one, intentionality, looks at, did the author, whoever that author is, intend on what they were writing down to actually be a Hebraism? So I don't want to allow apologists to just kind of throw something out there as being a Hebraism just because it happens to look Hebrew. They need to do the legwork to show that this was actually intended to be a Hebraism in the first place. I've found that a lot of the claims that they come up with are just these like out of left field assertions that, hey, this is Hebraic in origin, Hebraic in its nature, and so we should consider it as evidence because, how could Joseph Smith have possibly come up with this Hebraism? But most of those have a tendency to fail on this particular criterion. A good example of that would probably be something like Gershon. And we'll talk about this in the podcast series when we actually get into the relevant section in Alma where Gershon comes up. But where Gershon really seems to fall apart is on this idea of intentionality. Apologists wanted to the name Jershon to mean a certain thing based off of the Hebrew that somewhat resembles the name Jershon. And it's an interesting case. Like it is an interesting argument, and I did spend some time really looking into it and whether or not it even made sense in the first place. But there's nothing in the text itself of the Book of Mormon that actually points towards Jershon being at all what apologists are trying to say that it means. And so it just fails on this particular point, in no small part because we don't have the source text. Basically, all of these issues are coming up because we don't have the source text. If we had that, then we would actually be able to evaluate the quality of the translation against the source text, and this would be a non-issue. But as it stands, because we're just going off of just the translation alone, we have to evaluate this in other ways. So intentionality is the first item here that I look at in any one of these, and a lot of the more unusual Hebraism claims, the more like specific ones, where they seem to just kind of come out of nowhere. Those tend to fail on intentionality. The second line is uniqueness or pertinence to the Hebrew language. So there are a lot of claims where basically they'll say that a certain structure shows up in Hebrew, that it is a Hebraism. But when you look at it, like English has that structure in no small part because of the influence of the Bible. There are Romance languages that have that name in places. Or sometimes they'll be making a claim where it's like, if you actually look into the language itself, what the apologist is saying the Hebrew says or doesn't actually work at all that way. This is actually one where I find that the if and conditional statements fail pretty hard on this particular line. And that's actually one of the more interesting apologetics that I've come across in this whole Hebraism space. I'm actually really excited for getting to the Helaman, the relevant Helaman section where we can talk about if and conditionals, because I've spent just a stupid amount of time actually looking at the apologetics for if and conditionals. And it is weirdly difficult to find any scholarship other than the Skousen article on that. We'll talk about that in more detail at that time, but I am looking forward to that conversation. But yeah, that one fails as an example on actually being pertinent to the to the Hebrew language, or even in necessarily being unique. And there's plenty of examples of that too. We're going to look at a video here as kind of an example, and we'll see one example where there's a certain name that's used as a Hebraism or argued as a Hebraism, and it will fail on all 3 points, but it will also fail on this uniqueness because it shows up in like other languages that Joseph would have had access to, including English. And then finally is the availability, or rather the unavailability to Joseph's milieu. And this one, generally every single one of these, not every single one, but a good chunk of these purported Hebraisms will fail on this particular point. You could almost lead with this one because it will knock out a solid like 80% of these Hebraisms. I think I'm really spitballing that statistic. This is one of those like 97% of all statistics are made up kind of things. But yeah, like a good chunk of these Hebraisms will fail specifically on the unavailability of Joseph's milieu. And the reason why is because most of the Hebraisms that you find in the Book of Mormon come from the Bible. They come from the KJV. And because they come from the KJV and they match these KJV structures, we can easily point to the KJV as an inspiration or as a source for that Hebraism, and that Joseph is just modeling his language after that particular language. And again, we're going to get into this video of Book of Mormon Central doing their longer interview with Dr. Parry, talking about these Hebraisms. And we'll look at an example of where like unavailability in Joseph's milieu kind of becomes an issue because we can basically take that same principle and then apply it to other things that have tried to sound the same way as the Bible, and how they've done the same thing that the Book of Mormon does for more comedic purposes. So yeah, let's go ahead and actually just pull the video up here. I'm gonna mess around with StreamYard for a second don't particularly like that. How about this? Am I about the right size there? I think this is a good share of the screen. Otherwise, I look really tiny. And I want to be big and imposing against the apologists here and look like I'm dominating the room. But yeah, let's go ahead and listen to what Dr. Parry, different Parry, so this is spelled differently. We're not related. But what Dr. Parry has to say about an example of Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon here in this interview.
So here's an example of many ands. And this is not English. In English, I'll read it quickly. So it says, and their wars, I'm just reading part of it, and their wars and contentions and dissensions and their preaching and their prophecies and their shipping and their building of ships and their building of temples and. That's not English. If someone wrote this for a high school English research paper and had so many ands, they would be marked down.
Okay, so this is almost an interesting point. Almost. I'm going to go ahead and drop him off of the panel here and expand my screen. I need to really mess around with my SteamYard settings here. I'm still learning how to kind of manage everything with that. So yeah, there's this idea of many ands. And so there's the many ands in the Book of Mormon. And so it's used as like, and this happened, and this, and this, and this. Well, I want you to think, so this is where we're going to fail completely on it being like unavailable, because it's all over the place in the KJV. It's all over the place in the KJV that if you wanted to make fun of the KJV and the way the KJV sounds, you would do this. If you want to imitate the way the KJV sounds, you would do this. Consider the second book of Armaments, chapter 2, verses 9 to 21. If you remember Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Armaments, chapter 2, verses 9 to 21, St. Anna raises the hand grenade up on high and says, "Oh Lord, bless us thy hand grenade, that thou mayest blow thy enemies to tiny bits. That thou mayest blow thine enemies to tiny bits in thy mercy. And the Lord did grin, and the people did feast upon the lambs and the sloths and the anchovies and the carp and the orangutans and the fruit bats and loins." And then we skip a bit, brother, right? That you have this series of ands as what the things that people are feasting upon. So is the second book of Armaments coming from an ancient Hebraic source? Like, no, it's comedy from the Monty Python troupe. They're making fun of the way the KJV sounds. Joseph Smith is doing the same thing, just not for a comedic purpose. He's doing it to try and make it sound religious, right? Like, this would be the naturalistic argument. This is why, because I have access to this very simple naturalistic argument due to this being very easily available in Joseph's milieu, I'm just going to go ahead and dismiss this as being like good evidence for the Book of Mormon having an ancient source. It doesn't mean that the Book of Mormon necessarily isn't ancient. It doesn't rule that out per se, but it does mean that this particular line of evidence can't be distinguished meaningfully from Joseph just having it come from his own mind, from that particular, or even many other naturalistic hypotheses. I'm going to go ahead and let me get my timestamp here. Thanks for bearing with me here. I'm going to pop to about the 6-minute mark in this video. And just a little bit before that, because we're going to get a little bit more here from Dr. Parry about another example of a Hebraism. And I have to look big and see, every time I pop that in, it's going to do that small screen just automatically, unless I switch it to the bigger screen first. But that's fine. Okay. Let's go ahead and have a listen to what Dr. Parry has to say for this next one.
Bible. From the Bible. Yeah. But one was not even known until the 1950s when a Jewish scholar whose name is Moses Seidel.
Okay, so real quick, we're doing really good at the start here, because this particular Hebraism, it's not known, right, in Joseph's milieu, is basically what Dr. Parry is arguing. However, listen to where this actually comes from.
He figured out a certain thing in the Hebrew Bible.
So it comes from the Hebrew Bible. So right here we see that it's available in the Old Testament, right? So this researcher, Dr. Seidel, has made this discovery of this particular structure, this particular Hebraism, and we'll get into what it actually is. But this isn't something that scholars were necessarily aware was going on, but it's at least a structure that already exists in the Hebrew Bible, which means it is actually available in Joseph's milieu, right? Joseph can read this, and consciously or not, he can imitate it. We'll get into what this actually is.
The Old Testament, and he published it, and the article was in Hebrew. Not everyone knows about this, and it's a way the ancients would quote earlier prophets. And when we quote someone, we will say, and President so-and-so or Professor so-and-so said this, and we'll use quote.
I just want to laugh for a second here about like his use of like leading into this quote by saying, and so said this, as though that's not something that would work in English. Seems to work really well in like orally dictated English.
Marks, and then we'll have a bibliographic footnote. But one way the ancients would do it is they would switch some keywords. And I'll just give you one example from the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so switching keywords. This is the way that we're going to do this, right? Just switching keywords around is the way, apparently, of quoting some earlier source that couldn't possibly be from like getting it slightly wrong, having a scribal error, scribal changes, those sorts of things necessarily. Like that's fine. I haven't looked into Dr. Scribel's scholarship fully on this. I'm only assessing this as far as like the Book of Mormon is concerned. And so remember, we have to deal with this being like intentional as well. So right now we've kind of already rolled out the unavailability and justice milieu factor, but let's look at intentionality on this one, because this is one of those that's kind of coming out of left field, right? So the Book of Mormon has to actually intend on this being a quotation of this other source, and it needs to intend on doing that by switching around some lines.
And it's there are many in the Book of Mormon, and the example is, let me just make sure I get it right here so I don't misstate it in front of the camera. Hold on, sorry. All right, here's an example. So Isaiah wrote precept upon precept, line upon line. Oh, Isaiah 28.
Yeah.
Precept upon precept, line upon line. So Nephi cited Isaiah and he switched the key elements. And he said line upon line, precept
I was going to say, you're saying.
Yeah, and this has been pointed out before. It's not just Nephi that does this. Joseph does it again, or rather Jesus does it again in the Doctrine and Covenants. I feel like being raised in the church, like the way that I always heard it was line upon line, precept upon precept. That was the way that we always kind of discussed it, because it shows up this way in both Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Mormon. Which of these is more likely? The Book of Mormon has an ancient origin that where a supernatural entity helped to translate this golden codex by a supernatural power through an early 19th century farm boy, or a 19th century farm boy was really familiar with the Bible and was quoting it, and then just kind of got a couple of words mixed up in his quotation, and then did the same thing again in another work later on. I'll let you kind of make the determination of which of those is more likely, but if you end up not agreeing with me, then you're wrong. Yeah, this is going to fail definitely on intentionality. I don't see how you could demonstrate that the author of the Book of Mormon intended on this being a Hebraic style quotation of Isaiah. This is definitely intended on being a quotation of Isaiah. Like, I'm not dismissing that. This was definitely a quotation of Isaiah, and Joseph is wont to do that. But a Hebraic version of that, just the fact that it shows up in the Doctrine and Covenants, and I want to thank the other commenter on here, who I should actually shout out. Let me shout out. Oh, dang, I lost it here. Give me 1 second to shout out this commenter who brought this to my attention. Paul Black, 1799. Thank you so much, actually, on pointing this out, that yeah, it's in the Doctrine and Covenants. And I knew that it showed up in other places, but it's been a hot minute since I've read the Doctrine and Covenants. And so remembering exactly where all these references are can be itself a chore. Excuse me. All right, let's go on to the next one. So the next one I find interesting because we're going to deal with a name. And apologists sure sometimes love coming up with these names. I mentioned Jershon earlier. This one's fun because it used to get shot down for another reason. But we're going to see. I'm going to kind of pop into this area here. All right.
Hebrew-like item are names. There are some Hebrew names in the Book of Mormon that were unknown to the world when Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon.
Do you want to take like a few guesses about which name he's going to go with? Is it going to be one of the ones that actually is like kind of interesting and cool, or is it going to be one of the ones that's kind of boring and lame and actually entirely doesn't work for like myriad reasons and is actually kind of obvious how Joseph would have come up with it? I'll let you guess there.
Give you one example that I really, really like, and it's the name Alma. And when Joseph Smith translated...
Did you have Alma? You probably saw the video beforehand. If you're watching this one, like, honestly, you probably would... Yeah, if you've discovered our podcast, like, honestly, at this point, you have probably watched all of the other ones that are already about this, and I am way down on your list of people you've come across on this. But thank you for joining. But yeah, Alma is an interesting example. And for the sake of, not getting any sort of like copyright strike or anything like that, I think I'm like perfectly within the fair use zone on this. But for the sake of that, Dr. Parry is going to bring that up because early on, the common criticism about the name Alma is that it comes from the Romance languages and it's a feminine name. And even if you were to go into like the Hebrew, then you have like Alma, which is the word that shows up in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, where, it talks about a virgin shall conceive, right? But that's the word that gets you, but that's the word that's for a virgin in the KJV, but it's more accurately translated as like young maiden. He's going to point out that around near the Dead Sea Scrolls location in Qumran, there was a finding of like a legal document that that dates to the 2nd century CE, that has the name like Alma ben Judah, or Alma son of Judah, right? And there you have it showing up in the right place, the wrong time, mind you. Like it's a 700-800 years too late to really influence the Nephites in any meaningful way. Yeah, this is going to fail on multiple points for a few different reasons. So one, anytime these names discussions come up, we're going to have an intentionality issue, especially like the later on that they are. And by later on, I mean if it's not in the replacement text, if it's not in like First Nephi through Omni, really through Jerem, you're going to run into a problem with intentionality. It's just so far removed at that point in time. Like culturally, should have a people that are very distinct from their old world counterparts. And so the naming conventions should shift. They should shift based off of the culture, based off of where they're located, the other peoples that they're interacting with, the other ideas and philosophies that are influencing them. These names should start to kind of change in a different direction. And we kind of see that happening, like even if you look at like the naming conventions today versus those that our parents had and so on and so forth, right? Like naming conventions start to kind of change and move around. Even countries that are like right next to each other, you're going to see different sorts of naming conventions based off the respective cultures. So intentionality is a hard one for these names to clear. And it's honestly kind of, I think, one of those things that shows up as an issue for the Book of Mormon, that so many Hebrew names actually persist in the Nephite nation, like long after, like hundreds of years too. But it's not necessarily a hard hit because they are supposed to have access to the brass plates. So unless the name Alma as a masculine name is showing up in somewhere on the brass plates, I don't see really a good way of preserving that across the ocean. So that's one hit. The other hit will come with the uniqueness to Hebrew, or the pertinence to Hebrew, right? So especially uniqueness. So the name Alma shows up in the Romance languages. It means like soul, and it's feminine. If it's used as a personal name, it is always feminine. I don't know that would necessarily show up as an exception, which could have some really cool progressive implications for the Book of Mormon, honestly, like if we really wanted to go down that road. And I just might, when we get into the series, start playing around with like some of the ideas of like how we could actually read the Book of Mormon as maybe a little bit more of a queer text based off of those sorts of things. But yeah, could be kind of interesting that way. Definitely not what was actually intended by the author, but hey, it's fun to do a little bit of eisegesis and make the text actually fit your time, your worldview. If it's good enough for the goose being the apologist, then it's good enough for the gander on our side. Okay. The other issue is that there's a couple of podcasts that have talked about this. I think they showed up on like Mormonism Live at one point, where the name Alma as a masculine name actually appears in like upstate New York around the time that Joseph Smith would have been in that area, to like the point that Joseph may very well have known a male Alma. And there's actually a decent enough chance that he did. In which case, drawing the name from there as an inspiration It's available in his milieu as well, right? So that's going to be a kind of a double ding where it's not unique to the Hebrew because it shows up in these other languages. And also it's available in Justice Milieu, so he would have had access to it in that particular way. So this one happens to fail on all 3 counts, which is decently impressive. Like I said, most of them actually get like 1 or 2 of these factors. So failing on all 3 fronts is pretty cool. Let's see here. I am going to progress along here a little bit. I'm just going to my notes. Every time I do that, yeah, okay. This next one is fun. Let's go to about 11 minutes and 30 seconds in and see what we land on. I think I did this too late. We'll see.
Cognates or cognate, there it is, cognate verbs and...
Okay, so the cognate verbs, I think I call this compound cognates in my comments. So if you go onto the video and you see me talk about compound cognates, what I am actually talking about is the cognate verbs. Just grabbed the wrong word. Okay, let's listen to what they have to say.
Objects. Explain to me what that is, or explain to us.
That's a grammatical form where the noun and the verb are the same root. For example, to build buildings, to dream a dream, to sing a song, to curse with a curse.
Okay, so we have these different examples. These are all, oops, I may have messed that up here. I don't know if you were able to hear that. I'm going to assume you couldn't, and I'm going to replay that because I failed to put that up on the screen. My bad. It showed the audio here, but if you didn't hear that, then there's just this weird blank spot where I'm looking all kinds of excited about what I'm hearing, and you aren't. So let me fix that and go ahead and press play on this one here again.
Cognate, there it is, cognate verbs and objects. Explain to me what that is, or explain to us.
So yeah, cognate verbs and objects. We've been through that. Sorry.
That's a grammatical form where the noun and the verb are the same root. For example, to build buildings, to dream a dream, to sing a song, to curse with a curse.
Okay, so all these examples in English: to build a building, to curse with a curse, to sing a song, right? These are ways where the noun and the verb are doing the same thing, and we're kind of doing the same compound, and it's kind of creating this like almost poetic way of referring to the action. To perform a performance, right, would be like another example, or yeah. I don't know. There's probably a bunch of different ways that we could go about doing this. It could show up all over the place. All right. So I mean, at this point in time, we should hopefully have you well and trained on using this 3-factor system. So what do you see in this one as being the criteria? How does it like stack up on this criteria? So how does this do with intentionality? In any of these examples, because these are all actually examples from the Book of Mormon. To dream a dream, to I think to build a building is not. But like Lehi definitely says like I've dreamed a dream. So let's take that one. How intentional is that in being Hebraic? I actually think it passes that particular criteria myself. And the reason why is because I think that the author is trying to sound biblical. Is it unique to Hebrew? Well, or does it pertain to Hebrew? I mean, these are, we're going to look at these somewhat separately, actually. So unique to Hebrew, technically, no. You can have plenty of different examples of this showing up. It might be odd in different languages, but I think that the KJV has had such an influence, and there's the peak to where we'll go with that last point. The KJV has had such an influence on the English language that this is now something that's kind of recognized as maybe a little bit old-timey. I'm going to let them actually give the word for it. But, it's in English. There are other languages where you could take the noun form and the verb form and do this sort of thing. It's not necessarily every language has that as a convenient structure per se, but a lot of languages do. I think the Indo-European languages generally do. So I don't think that it meets the unique to Hebrew standard. And then pertaining to Hebrew. So the problem is, I don't know for certain what the nouns and the verbs are for dream and dream, or build and build, or those sorts of things. Build a building, right? I don't know what those would be in Hebrew. They might work. They might not. And I think without having the source text on that one, it's hard to actually make the case that any one of these is pertinent, especially if there are multiple synonyms for these different words that you might be able to use in these different contexts. You'd actually have to show a good case that any one of these would actually meet that particular standard. But remember, this is going to fail on intentionality, it's going to pass on intentionality. It's going to probably fail on on uniqueness in any one of the cases where it appears in the English, you'd have to show one of these as being like it exists in the Hebrew, and then maybe you could get pertinent. So if you had like the verb and then the noun in this form, and those were not a compact or a cognate verb structure in the English, but it was in the Hebrew, you might be able to make that work. I don't think any of the ones that Dr. Parry here shows would quite meet that standard. And then, of course, in terms of like availability and Joseph's milieu, yeah, like if you had a good example of the basically the word in English, or the word in English, or the verb in English and the noun in English, not doing this cognate verb structure, but it working in the Hebrew, you could pass on criteria 2, and you could pass probably on criteria 3, almost certainly actually on criteria 3, with it being not available in Joseph's milieu. But you would then fail on intentionality. You'd have to show that the author intended for that Hebraic structure to actually be there, and that it's not just simple coincidence. And I don't know how you would necessarily get to that point. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to help you out here. Apologies, but I think you're kind of in a pickle on this one where there may not be a way of quite passing the 3-factor test. But I do want to kind of let them dig their own hole here just a little bit.
If some you've got it
Okay,
here.
thanks.
Tax with a tax.
Yes.
Fear exceedingly with fear.
Yes.
Shielded by shields. Judged righteous judgments, on and on. Now, those are the ones that you found in the Book of Mormon.
Yes. This is very, very Hebrew. That's how they do it in the Hebrew Bible. For example, we'd never say we are taxed.
Okay, so remember, so Dr. Parry here is saying that this is how they do it in the Hebrew Bible, which I want to reiterate. If it's in the Hebrew Bible, it's available in Joseph's milieu, right? Like if any of these shows up in English this way in the KJV, which I really think that he's arguing off of. I don't think that he's making this argument because I really don't think that he's making this argument based off of any sort of like Hebrew, based especially off of the ones that he claims to have found in the Book of Mormon, using those as claims from the Book of Mormon, and they all work in English that way. I just kind of doubt that that's the case, that these necessarily work in Hebrew the same way. Anyway, let's press on.
The tax in English.
Doesn't sound right.
No.
It sounds biblical.
Yeah, it's very biblical.
It sounds biblical. Yeah, it's very biblical. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Parry. I appreciate that. You are 100% correct. It sounds biblical. It's very biblical. I honestly don't know that I could have said it better myself on that one. The fact that this sounds biblical, and we can easily understand that the Book of Mormon is Joseph Smith's attempt at writing scripture, at doing pseudepigrapha, and he's trying to sound biblical. That is what he's trying to accomplish. And these are the tools that he's using to make that happen. And if we look at it from that perspective, this all fits without needing any sort of supernatural explanation for where it came from. There is a response to my comment on this that I did find kind of funny, because it's like, yeah, Joseph Smith, with less than a 3rd grade education, and yeah, he just magically came up with all of these. Well, yeah, that's funny, because that's the general response that I get from apologists on this, is they will leap right to Joseph's education. And I'm sorry, I don't know, beyond the KJV and familiarity with 19th century American Protestantism, what you would need to actually write the Book of Mormon. I think that you can actually address everything that Joseph would have needed with those 2 things. There are some who have pointed to other possible sources of influence on Joseph, but I don't find them necessary as of yet, so I don't incorporate them into this model. All I think you need are the KJV and 19th century American Protestantism. And if you've listened to like some of like the Alexander Campbell sermons and some of those more like early 19th century sermons, you'll hear like very similar ideas, either that Joseph is taking down in the Book of Mormon, or that he is like trying to exemplify as being like the right standard. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you would need beyond that. And so when it sounds biblical, it's just like the Monty Python sketch at that point in time. It's just like the second book of Armaments at that point, except you're not trying to do comedy. You're trying to actually do like a pious creation. And yeah, you're just kind of making some special pleading. The last thing that comes up in this video, I'm not going to go through and show it because it's not specifically relevant to this whole Hebraisms idea, but it's the thing that I see from apologists a lot, is they'll put forward this very weak evidence, and that's pretty easily shot down. I mean, I was able to just kind of riff off of using this 3-factor test that I came up with as a layperson that I think is actually pretty useful. By the by, like, please let me know if I'm missing something from this test, or if something seems unfair, or if I should be adding something to it or explaining something about it better. I'm trying to develop this test a little bit further and actually get it to be something that makes more robust sense, and something that could actually potentially be applied to like other manuscript claims. It's hard to find other claims that are so similar to the Book of Mormon that they could actually, that this test would be useful for anything outside of Book of Mormon studies. But you know, I'd like to actually get this a little bit more developed. So if you've got some comments and feedback on it, I would really love the feedback, and trying to get that developed. But yeah, all that said, that Dr. Parry is going to end this with basically privileging the Book of Mormon on 3 different points. The first point is that it testifies of Jesus Christ. The second point is that it has the witness of the Holy Ghost. And the third point is that it improves people's lives. Just because the text testifies of Jesus Christ, why should we privilege it? I could have easily imagined, right, somebody writing down an entire text of just absolute horrible things, but trying to make it all in reference to Jesus. In fact, I think that's how the Westboro Baptist Church exists. I think that's how the NIFB exists. I think that that's how like all of these other like hate churches that are listed as like hate groups and hate churches exist, is by referring to Jesus Christ and then trying to make it all about hate and just horrible ideas outside of that. So I think that that's entirely possible. I don't know why we would privilege that per se for its truth value, unless you've already kind of accepted it. I think that there's just kind of a special pleading criterion. I don't think that that's very good. The next is that the witness of the Holy Ghost thing generally, and I don't want to dismiss people's like spiritual experiences. So here's where I stand just generally on spiritual experiences. If somebody comes to me and they claim that they've had a spiritual experience, I believe that they have an experience. I'm willing to completely accept that they experienced the thing that they said. My issue is with the interpretation. So if you're going to sit there and say that the Spirit testified to you of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, therefore you know that it's true, like I believe you when you say that you had these feelings that you associate with the Spirit, that testified that the Book of Mormon was true. Like I'm with you on that. Like we're good. I get all of that. Where I don't agree with you is in that interpretation that indicates that the Book of Mormon is true. You're going to need to do some additional legwork to actually show that that's the case. Because if you've seen any of like the spiritual witness videos for like other traditions and all that out there, you can find people testifying about all sorts of stuff using the same kind of language. And if you know, there's the Heaven's Gate documentary it showed up in the Mormon Stories podcast video on this as well, the spiritual witnesses in different faiths. They all sound the same. It sounds really, really similar. The only thing that you can say is they don't use the same words that I do. And that just seems like a really poor way of separating these two things, because why are your words better than their words? Like you need to do some legwork in establishing all of that. So when your spiritual claim and their spiritual claim sound exactly the same and these are competing incompatible claims, you're going to need to show me why one of these is better than the other, and give good reason, good like consistent reason for why that's the case. And then the final point that he makes on that is that it improves people's lives, and like that's why the self-help industry exists. There have been lots of crap that's put in the self-help industry, and you can find all sorts of people testifying about how much it helps them. This is not to say that like the entire self-help industry is bad. I'm sure that there's good stuff out there, and I've heard people testify about some of the good stuff that actually works for them. So great, kudos to you. I don't know. When it comes to most of that stuff, I'm going to be generally pretty skeptical. I want good evidence outside of just, hey, it made my life better. Like, show me the data that actually supports, like, in a statistically significant way, this improves people's lives. And the Book of Mormon kind of lacks that. I don't see like statistically significant evidence that's consistent across the board or anything along those lines. You can find certain like things that, certain aspects of the LDS lifestyle are actually like pretty healthy, are they have certain benefits. It's not the only way to get those benefits and all of that. That's a whole other long discussion. But yeah, like life expectancy in Utah is has generally been higher than most of the rest of the United States, though not necessarily most of the rest of the world. I think that Japan still has Utah beat in life expectancy. And I imagine that the environmental collapse of the Salt Lake is going to really affect life expectancy in Utah here in the long run. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, like there are parts of the LDS lifestyle that they're good for you, and putting that on a community level is pretty solid. Most of that doesn't actually come from the Book of Mormon, though. So I don't know. Like this is not a dismissal. I know people have had their lives improved by the Book of Mormon before. Like even Bill Reel has like his conversion story. I think is a good example of like there are times in your life where the Book of Mormon may be the thing that you need to get you through that, and I think that's great. Like I'm here for that. That doesn't mean it's true. That just means that it's useful for a time. And I think that there are all sorts of things that are not strictly speaking true, but they end up being useful for a time. And yeah, like that's fine. Things don't have to be true to be useful or beneficial. Like Dungeons and Dragons isn't true, but man, it's a great way to get to socialize and to have some fun with friends if you can actually get them together. Like there's stuff like that where you can learn lessons from all sorts of different things, and it's great. It's fine. But yeah. So basically just kind of in closing to Dr. Parry's whole video there, just to make sure that we kind of like tie this whole thing up in a bow. None of the Hebraisms that he brings up meet the 3-factor test here, are able to actually pass all 3 points of the 3-factor test. And I am hoping to actually improve the 3-factor test. We'll continue to refer to it. Also help me to come up with a better name than the 3-factor test, because that's what I'm at right now. Because as much as I may have fun with coming up with these tests, I'm not good at naming things. If the titles to my videos are of any indication of that, I am not good at naming things. And yeah, in his closing comments, I don't know why they would be relevant. I don't know why we would consider them as being pertinent to evaluating the truth claims of the Book of Mormon. So, we'll continue pressing on in our podcast, talking about the actual scholarship for it, or talking about some of the moral lessons that we can actually draw from the text from a humanistic perspective. I'm hoping to really emphasize that more. You should see more of that in this week's episode. When we talk about 2nd Nephi, I think 26 through 30, there's a lot of, I think, actually really good lessons in there to discuss, some of which are, I think, ways that we can actually address the issues ongoing in sort of broader Mormonism. And yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much for joining me on this. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all those fun YouTube things. And really, I do look forward to your comments. I try to respond to every single one that comes in. And I think that we're doing some interesting stuff here that others are doing, or maybe aren't as much. I think we're synthesizing ththings in ways that maybe others aren't. And so, I appreciate the shares with other folks and the comments, just the engagement in general. It's a lot of fun, and I enjoy talking about this stuff. So I'm hoping to have more conversations with all of you. And that's really what I'm hoping to gain from this, is just more conversations and dialogue. And hopefully somebody can break my 3-factor test. I would really love to see this actually fall apart somewhere, so that way I can try and actually improve it. Because so far the challenges that I've gotten to it have been pretty poor. But I would love to see a good effective challenge to it. So thank you all. And I will see you this weekend when we go over 2nd Nephi 26 through 30. It's going to be loads of fun. Thank you all. Bye.